Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation's Policy for the People series, a 6-part virtual brain trust providing critical policy updates on the most pressing issues facing the Black community in the United States in the era of combating COVID-19. I'm your host today, Dr. Mena Demise, Vice President of the Center for Policy Analysis and Research and the Leadership Institute. And you are joining us today for Water Justice in a Global Pandemic. This marks the CBCF's final virtual brain trust. We are so honored to have Senator Kamala Harris join us today, as well as our stellar expert panelists you will meet in a moment. First, we want to thank all of you who have tuned in and engaged with us on these critical issues since April. We've talked about the census turnout in the Black community with Congressman Stephen Horsford. We've talked about the economic stimulus package with Congresswoman Terry Sewell, water governance and diversity in the water sector with Majority Whip Jim Clyburn, advancing digital equity with Committee Chair of Science, Space, and Technology, Congresswoman Eddie Bernice Johnson, as well as our CBC Tech 2020 leaders, Congresswoman Barbara Lee and Congressman G.K. Butterfield. Last week, we gleaned critical insight on the double pandemic and the public health crisis our community faces with Congresswoman Robin Kelly. And today, we close our programming to return to the critical work of water justice in a global pandemic. Please join us at #CBCFINC. Let us know your thoughts, and also join us for questions our panelists will be answering towards the close of this conversation. You can also go to our website at www.cbcfinc.org to access any of the previous webinars. We also look forward to having you join us again for our upcoming annual legislative conference, how to support the foundation with our internships and scholarships for the next generation of leaders. And we also want to let you know that we recently launched a national racial equity initiative for social justice in order to effectively combat racism and discrimination and everything from law enforcement to the courts, classroom, and the workplace. We will also be providing social justice scholarships for students at HBCUs, as well as offering social justice policy fellowships for young leaders who want to make a difference on Capitol Hill and across the country. Before introducing Senator Harris, let me also acknowledge our fantastic leading experts in water who are advancing water justice that you'll hear from today. Our very own Dr. Afia Zakiya, our Water Infrastructure and Workforce Development Fellow. You'll also hear from Jacqueline Patterson, Director of the NAACP's Environmental and Climate Justice Program. Dr. Mustafa Santiago Ali, Vice President for Environmental Justice, National Wildlife Federation. And last but not least, Monica Lewis-Patrick, President and CEO of We the People of Detroit. This discussion today situates safe water affordability and sustainable water at the center of the COVID-19 public health crisis. Across the nation, continue to face challenges providing affordable and quality water for residents in equitable and sustainable ways. And both race and racial discrimination continue to strongly predict inequitable water and sanitation services and affordability when it comes to Black and Brown communities. Engage with us and ask your questions in our chat feed. We're also being broadcast on Facebook Live, where you can also tune into this conversation. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce to you the great Senator Kamala Harris from the great state of California. As many of you know, in 2017, she was sworn in as the United States Senator for California, the second African-American woman and first South Asian American senator in history. She currently serves on the Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee, the Select Committee on Intelligence, the Committee on the Judiciary, and the Committee on the Budget. Senator Harris was also elected as the first African-American and first woman to serve as California's Attorney General. In this role, she worked tirelessly to hold corporations accountable and protect the state's most vulnerable people. She's also always been an outspoken, fearless advocate for civil rights on the front lines of so many of our country's pressing issues: criminal justice reform, public safety, immigration reform, women and children's rights, so many, and also one of the strongest advocates in our country for water justice, equity, and opportunity. Her leadership has demanded our country do better and invest in water infrastructure, safety, and affordability. Without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Senator Kamala Harris.
Thank you, Mena, and for all the work that you are doing and leading the work of policy and on behalf of the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. I'm honored to be with this incredible and very esteemed group of leaders, national and international leaders. on these issues. So I thank you, each of the panelists, for the work you do, the inspiration you provide me and so many others, and also the work that we've done together over the years. You know, this is, you know, people are talking about this as a moment. I think that what we all know is this is a movement. And right now, where we are is we are seeing a convergence of three critical crises in our country. There's obviously a public health pandemic, which has resulted, second, in an economic crisis. And then third, the crisis that we have faced as a nation since our founding has been again highlighted, which is the issue of systemic racism in America and the need to address that. And there's an intersection between all of these, of course, that relates to the subject of today. When we think about the need for safe, affordable, and sustainable water, when we put the need in the context of history and present day challenges, we know that there is a historical basis for this conversation that has to do with systemic racism. We know that there is a component of this conversation that is about the acknowledgement of pre-existing health conditions which are exacerbated when there is not access to clean water, affordable water, and sustainable water sources. And we know there's an economic impact to all of this, both in terms of those who are low income being most severely impacted, but also the opportunities that also exist in this moment for giving people economic opportunities if we are smarter as a country in the way that we address the need for clean water for all people equally and equitably. So I'll just get right into some of my thoughts. You know, we are right now taking to the streets yet again to march for justice and racial justice. And of course, that includes environmental justice. You know, I started an environmental justice unit of the San Francisco DA's office back when I was elected. I was elected in 2003. And when we look at where we are today, it is clear that environmental justice, a big part of it, is about racial justice. We know that race is the #1 indicator of where you will find toxic facilities. 70% of Americans that live in the highest air pollution areas of our country are people of color. So of all people who live in the highest air pollution areas of our country, 70% are people of color. Black children are 3 times more likely to have elevated lead levels. So we know, just with those statistics alone, but the experts on this panel will cite so many more, that the fight for environmental justice is a fight for racial justice. And racism has fueled, as we know, deadly policies. And that relates to everything from policing to housing to the environment. So this conversation today is obviously, in the context of all of that and so much more, a very important conversation. Clean water. Clean water is a human right. It should be thought of as a human right. It also obviously brings up issues of civil rights. But our laws should reflect the fact that access to clean water should be thought of and considered and understood to be a human right. Flint, again, the experts on this panel are the leaders and have been the leaders in fighting for the people of Flint, Michigan. And but we know that there, as an example, maybe one of the most well-known examples, it was the result of systemic racism and a failure of government, quite frankly, and sadly, not an isolated example of those points. In California, more than 1 million people have unsafe drinking water each year. And so what that results in is that people can't trust the safety of their own water. And what we also know is they can't afford it either. So we're talking about, one, people not having access to safe water, and then compounded on that is the affordability of water. And again, that brings back the point about human rights. How is it that we say that access to water is a function of how much money you have in your back pocket, or how much money you make if you earn an income at all? So that brings me to the point about affordable water. Families cannot afford water and their water bills right now in America, and water is getting shut off in many communities where people cannot afford their water bill. And this is something that we have to continue to let people know, because I think this is still part of what is hidden in terms of the injustices that people in America face and experience. That literally people are getting their water shut off because they cannot afford the water bill. And that in the midst of a pandemic where every day and multiple times a day, families and individuals are told one of the best ways to avoid contracting a virus that can kill you is to wash your hands. Well, if folks can't afford water, that means they can't afford to avoid a virus that can kill them. Again, this is about, obviously, a human rights issue as well as an issue of equity and an issue of just justice. So, on March 13th, I will tell you, I called for a moratorium on water shutoffs during the pandemic for that very reason. And we're going to have to continue. So many of the moratoriums, be it on rent and evictions and other things, it's for many places likely to end as there is this so-called reopening of America. And I would encourage all of the leaders who are part of this convening to do what we need to do to ensure that those moratoriums on water shutoffs continue during the course of the pandemic, whether or not we are so-called reopened or not. Because until there's a vaccine, and this is what I'm going to say, not until there's a vaccine, period, until there is a vaccine that has been available to and administered to all people who need it, everybody, regardless of their status, geographic, socioeconomic, race, age, should have access to water, and money and income and payment should not be the barrier to them having access to what is obviously a precious life-saving resource. And then, we can go on and talk about, and we should, about the problems, but I also want to just talk about a couple of what I think are practical solutions, at least within the sphere of where I work in the Senate and in the legislature. So I'll talk about two in particular. One is I introduced what we named the Water Justice Act with Representative Brenda Lawrence from Michigan and Representative Kildee, also from Michigan. And essentially it would provide $250 billion to address clean and affordable and sustainable water issues. We would also declare a drinking water infrastructure emergency, and then that would be, we would dedicate $50 billion to repair infrastructure in frontline communities and fund them like we would do repairs in natural disasters, which means that we would do it with the same sense of urgency with which we approach natural disasters, or at least with which we should approach natural disasters. Also, part of the Water Justice Bill is that we would provide $10 billion to help families afford their water bills. And most notably in the HEROES Act, which is currently out of the House, is designed to be the next COVID bill to bring relief to folks. There is $1.5 billion of that would be in the HEROES bill. So that's something to take note of in our advocacy for passage of the HEROES bill. I'm also proud to be a partner with Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in the Climate Equity Act. So we have that act, which basically would allow communities of color and frontline communities to be engaged on the front end to actually help design the policy. For so many years of policy, folks have said, well, let's get the community involved by doing a community impact study. Well, the problem with that, as I see it, is that basically you're getting the community involved by telling the community what you already done to them, as opposed to what we need to do, which is bringing in the community and leaders within the community at the front end to help design whatever and to dictate what is going to be most helpful to their community to have real impact and relevance. So that's one of the key points of that piece of legislation. And there are many more, and I'm happy to follow up with anybody. But I will say in closing that in the midst of these days where the front, the front page, if you read it, if you still read the paper, but if you go online, if you watch the evening news, we haven't really heard a lot of talk about water and the importance of water. But it is without any question one of the most critical issues facing so many people in our country today. And it is obviously connected to all of the other issues that right now are grabbing the nation's attention. So I thank the leaders on this call and this convening and the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation for reminding us all of the need to keep pushing on this, to keep prioritizing this. We would not be in this critical stage of needing to fight for sustainable and affordable and accessible water if people had prioritized it the way they should. So the advocacy of everyone here is so important to push these systems and force these systems to be accountable to communities and to just do the right thing. And so I want to thank everybody for your work. Again, this is not a moment, this is a movement, and I am with you. So thank you all.
Thank you so much, Senator Harris, for your leadership. Thank you for being on the front lines of this issue, and thank you for constantly emphasizing the human rights framework on these issues. We appreciate it, and we look forward to continued work together to advance water justice, equity, and opportunity for our community. So thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. Okay, I'll see you soon.
Okay, take care. And with that, folks, I'd like to turn it over now to our panelists. You'll hear from each of them, and then we'll engage in a discussion and take your questions. First, we'd like to introduce to you Dr. Afia Zakiya, as I mentioned, our Water Infrastructure and Workforce Development Senior Research Fellow. To learn more about her work and read some of her previous publications like Water Careers and Opportunities for African Americans or Apprenticeships, Pathways Toward Workforce Diversity in the Water Sector, please join us at our website to learn more about the work we're doing under her leadership. Dr. Afia brings 2 to 3 decades of experience in the water sector as a global water and environmental justice activist and scholar. She was the country director for Water Aid in Ghana and a distinguished Investing in Women in Development fellow, gender advisor for USAID with the Africa Bureau in DC, and is also currently a Fulbright Specialist Scholar. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to her for her perspectives on these issues. Dr. Zakiya.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. Again, thank you for joining us in this critical discussion. It's sort of a bittersweet moment for us in the social justice movement and the water justice movement, which is, part of the broader environmental justice movement that's been, organizing to address issues in our community since the 70s. We know now, because of the global pandemic, the health issues that we have, that water issues are actually coming more to light. Not always so much for a good reason, but because this issue of affordability and shutoffs has, brought the attention of the water injustices and water unaffordability issues. But we know that water is life. We know we can't live without it. No one can live, biologically, we have to have it. But it's also essential for ecology and for nature and for a sustainable environment to exist. So we have to begin to grapple with these issues more in our daily lives. One of the things that's been interesting is the assumption that people make that everybody in the US has, access to safe, clean, affordable water. And we know that's not true. The most recent study by Dig Deep and the US Water Alliance documented over 2 to 3 million people without water, without access to water. So it's not just a so-called developing country issue, it's an issue right here in the nation. But one of the things about that about the issue of not having, counting the numbers and trying to be clear about who doesn't have access. First, we have to, of course, track the shutoffs that are happening. But in general, there's also a need to revisit the census. The census is happening right now. And one of the questions that was on the census in the past asked people, you know, if they had access to water and sanitation in their homes. And that question is not there anymore. So there's going to be a data gap that's going to continue to exist in terms of the extent of this, the crisis of lack of affordable water and access to water and sanitation services across this nation. And we know that right now the data is showing that, you know, in the South, Mississippi Delta, Alabama, everybody has, you know, hears about what's happening in Flint and Detroit and Baltimore and some of the major cities, but we also have to have our lens looking geographically in other areas, including some of the Central Valley areas in California, indigenous people and other, you know, groups that are being disproportionately affected by not having safe access to safe, clean, and affordable water. I want to, you know, also, I know I just have a few minutes, we're going to dig deeper into these issues, but the issue about the human rights to water, I think is very important, because one of the central tenets that's permeating in the water justice movement and the social justice movement is this notion of the human right to water. Well, we know that, I think back in 2003, the UN declared water as a human right. But in the US, of course, it is not the case. Nationally, California has, I think, passed the law, legislation declaring the human right to water, but across the country, it's not. And so this issue about whether or not water should be, how do we best price water so that it's affordable, you know, really comes to how well the utilities, how well we are engaging governance, water governance, and people who are in power to make decisions about who gets water, when, where, how, and at what cost. And the need to, of course, increase more water affordability programs and customer assistance programs across the nation. But I think in terms of the water justice movement, the other issue that I think is important is grappling around, and it's linked to the human rights issue, whether or not privatization is a factor that we also need to look at. What's happening with discussions around public versus private services of water, and how well are utilities managing their operations, estimating and knowing their costs, which get passed to, you know, consumers and customers in the prices of water across the nation. I know that there's also been, the water utilities themselves have requested through some of the coronavirus packages, you know, funding to help support their operations and to offset some of the losses that they anticipate having by, you know, paying for people who can't afford water, and also turning back on water for people who they have already turned water off. So this issue of shut on, shut off, cut on, cut off, you know, we really have to monitor that, because the public health implications linking the water justice movement with public health in this time of COVID-19 is important. But also, you know, just the fact that we have inequality, you know, gross inequality in income and wealth in this country, which is a factor as to why people are not able to afford water. So it's a social justice issue, it's an economic justice issue, it's a human rights issue, and all of these factors are things that we hope to talk about today. And I look forward to the conversation of digging more deeper into these areas.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Zakiya, for sharing your perspective. I'd now like to introduce again Dr. Mustafa Santiago Ali, Vice President for Environmental Justice with the National Wildlife Federation. Dr. Ali is a thought leader, strategist, policymaker, and activist committed to the fight for environmental justice and economic equity. He has worked at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency for 24 years. At the EPA, Dr. Ali served as the Assistant Associate Administrator for Environmental Justice and Senior Advisor for Environmental Justice and Community Revitalization. At the EPA, Dr. Ali led the Interagency Working Group on Environmental Justice, which was comprised of 17 federal agencies and the White House offices that focused on implementing holistic strategies to address the issues facing vulnerable communities. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Ali.
Thank you, Dr. Mena. And thank you to the esteemed panel that I'm blessed to be with today. We've been on a lot of journeys together over the years and trying to help to protect our communities, communities of color, lower wealth communities, indigenous populations. And our indigenous brothers and sisters have shared with us since the beginning of time of us being here in this country. And of course, our indigenous brothers and sisters who are in all the various countries around our planet, that water is life. We're 60% water. Many of our body parts are even a greater percentage of water. But we also understand that we come into this life through water. Our mothers loving us, protecting us until we take that first breath. And with that understanding, we also understand that there is a spiritual connection that we often don't talk about in relationship to water. For many people of color, we are connected through our cultural practices with water. I remember as a young boy hearing the voices from folks talking about wade in the water as folks began to make their ways down to the creeks and rivers to be able to connect with that higher power. And of course, that was happening through water. So when we pollute, damage water, we are also damaging our spirituality and the connection that exists inside of that space. And that's why when we have policies that have been created over the years that have been framed out in many instances through a systemic racism prism, through that lens, then we are infecting that relationship that exists between us and the Almighty. And I'll allow you to frame out what the name is for your Almighty. But we have that relationship. When we have administrations, whether on the state or the federal level, that are damaging that relationship, then we have a lot of work to do to make sure that that's corrected. You know, in our communities, in communities of color and lower wealth communities and on indigenous lands, we understand that the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, RCRA, Superfund, a number of these acts that were supposed to protect everyone, when they were written, they did not turn out that way. And that's why we have to make sure that we're addressing that. And why do we have to address that? Because we know in this COVID-19 moment that when you are impacted by many of the things that we're going to talk about today, then you are causing long-term chronic medical conditions that make people more vulnerable to COVID-19. But before COVID-19 was ever on the scene, we had literally millions of people who were dealing with unsafe drinking water. We have over 69, 70 million people over the last decade who have dealt with unsafe drinking water. We know if you look at the Safe Drinking Water Act and you look at the violations that have been in that space annually, we got 20 million people who are getting sick. And who are those people who are getting sick? We know that those small rural systems and some of our other small systems have challenges that we're going to have to talk about today about how we're going to address those. We also know in those larger systems, when we see these breaches, these impacts that happen, they get attention. And we've got to focus on making sure that that is addressed as well. And what does that look like? Because sometimes we have these theoretical conversations without actually talking about what that looks like. You know, in our communities, we're dealing with cumulative impacts all the time. And people have talked, you know, tirelessly and thankfully about the air impacts that continue to happen in our communities, but not enough about the water impacts, because you can actually be a victim of cancer because of what you have been exposed to that has been coming into your body through what you've drank or through other exposures from water. You also can deal with liver and kidney diseases that there is a correlation between, and a number of other public health impacts that we know are going on. But who are those communities? Because we need to call them out. You have folks at WAWA, the West Atlanta Watershed Association down in Atlanta, young people getting into the water, cleaning up the water because of the impacts that have continually happened there in the tributaries and the basins that are there. And the backups that continue to happen. So lots of times we talk about the water we're drinking, but we're not also talking about the other impacts that are happening in the water space that is connected. We can't break those apart. We're talking about places like WIRA, Omega Wilson's organization, and others. They're in Mebane, North Carolina, who for decades had been trying to get hooked up, who've been trying to make sure that they had access to the things that other communities, the basic amenities that we need to actually be able to live and to survive. In the Sand Branch in Texas, where development was happening for decades, but they didn't want to hook up Black folks because, you know, a number of different reasons. Well, it's just too expensive, or the lines won't run over here. No, the reality of the situation was that we place value on certain lives. And when we place that value on certain lives, that's when the impacts from these laws and statutes that we have on the books, folks need to step in and make sure folks are doing the right thing. And when we don't do that, we leave people more vulnerable. And now in this moment that we're living in today, we know that we are also shortening people's lives by the exposures that they have dealt with, sometimes for decades upon decades. So I thank y'all for giving me a few moments of your time, and I look forward to us unpacking the reality of what's going on and how we actually correct these past systemic. And when I say systemic, we're talking about the systems that have been put in place to either make sure that some people are thriving or making sure that some folks are just surviving.
Thank you, Dr. Ali, for that really passionate response. And I agree 100%. I think part of these conversations are really for us to understand the substantive policy focus, but also the practical aspect of these issues. And, you know, as we sit here in the midst of Black Lives Matter, we need to also take that down and localize what does it mean Black Lives Matter, right? In the context of all of these issues, not just criminal justice reform, but access to safe water and affordability and the ability to protect ourselves from this global pandemic. So thank you for your comments. I'd like to now turn it over to Jackie Patterson, Director of the NAACP's Environmental and Climate Justice Program. She has worked as a researcher, program manager, coordinator, advocate, and of course, activist working on human rights and women's rights issues, violence against women, HIV/AIDS, racial and economic justice, emergency response, and environmental and climate justice. She has published widely, as well as her recent report, Equity and Resilience, Building for Climate Adaptation and Indicators document, also Jobs versus Health, An Unnecessary Dilemma, as well as Climate Change is a Civil Rights Issue, among many others. So given her background and leadership in these areas, I'd also like to turn it over for her and thank her again for joining us to share your perspective. Ms. Patterson.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be with you. So I thank you so much to Senator Kamala Harris for her wisdom and leadership on the Water Justice Act and for bringing us together to have a conversation that's particularly critical in this moment. And as she said, movement. It's always an honor to share space with awesome leaders, Sister Monica Lewis-Patrick and Brother Mustafa Santiago Ali. And thank you so much to Dr. Minna and Dr. Afia and the mighty team at the CBCF for your thoroughly crafted organizing of this event. Appreciate it. And so I was asked to speak about the solutions around climate justice and the solutions around water justice and some of the examples that I've seen. In the words of our partner, Movement Generation, an economy based on extracting from a finite system faster than the capacity of the system to regenerate will eventually come to an end, either through collapse or through our intentional reorganization. Transition is inevitable, justice is not. So we're seeing this today at the inflection point we've reached with the converging and interconnected crises of the travesty of COVID-19 pandemic, our unraveling economy, catastrophic climate change, and the visibilization of what we've known as the virulent systemic racism that runs as a through line through all of these crises. And as a result, we've seen the uprising calling for our intentional reorganization as a society and an economy. Communities on the front line of climate change have seen the imperative to transition from a society rooted in exploitation, domination, and extraction to one that's grounded in principles of regeneration, cooperation, and deep democracy. Soul Fire Farm in New York and Earthseed Collective in North Carolina are advancing local food systems that provide for communities who are food insecure due to the vestiges of redlining, critically important in the time of COVID-19. Zero Waste Detroit and Texas Campaign for the Environment are leading on recovery, reuse, and recycling of waste to keep the waste away from landfills and incinerators that produce methane and other harmful pollutants. Co-op Power in Minnesota, Solidarity in Michigan, Native Renewables in California are all advancing community-owned energy, which advances community control and wealth building while preventing pollution caused by fossil fuel-based energy production. Uprose in New York, Power Shift, and the Sunrise Movement are anchoring youth leadership in climate justice. The Land Loss Prevention Project, Movement Generation are advancing land justice, while Push Buffalo and Right to the City lead the charge for housing justice. Make the Road New York is advancing immigration rights, including those who are coming to the US due to climate forced migration, while the US is 4% of the global population, where 25% of the emissions that are driving climate change. Another Gulf is Possible and Climate Strike are producing and catalyzing culture work, and the Center for Story-Based Strategy is facilitating narrative shift. The Democracy Initiative and Move to Amend are mobilizing to get money out of politics and out of the courts. The Kindred Healing Justice Collective and Green Muslims in Wisconsin are grounding us in much needed healing justice. The motto of the Bus Riders Union of Los Angeles is 1,000 more buses, 1,000 less police. This has been their motto for years, and it's all too relevant in this moment that recognizes that the intersection between less pollution from transit, more access to mobility, demilitarization are all keys to wellness for our communities. And relatedly, the Movement for Black Lives just released a comprehensive platform that centers racial justice and environmental and climate justice. Those are just a handful of the many groups who are leading on climate justice. All are contributing to the transformative movement that we need. In his speech, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community, Dr. Martin Luther King said, "We must honestly face the fact that the movement must address itself to the question of restructuring the whole of American society. We must come to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring." As you deal with this, you begin to ask the question, why is it that people have to pay for water bills in a world that is 2/3 water? In 2018, the NAACP took advantage of a special introductory $250 round-trip airfare to Iceland and organized a group of coastal dwelling African American and indigenous Native American youth on a journey called Linkages Across the Sea Level Rise Continuum, which was a mutual exploration of their connection to land and water. In our time together, the youth from the Atakapa, Ishak, Chawasha tribe and African American communities in Louisiana, Mississippi, and Hawaii talked about uses of water, from drinking to sanitation to cooking to growing to ceremony. They talked about how access to water is not promised in their communities. They described the challenges with infrastructure, affordability, and quality. Privatization of water, they said, has exacerbated this challenge. One youth commented on the unfairness of profiteering based on the essential resource of water. They also expressed concern about how water scarcity from drought has interfered with crops. They lamented about the surge of water in storms, flooding, and sea level rise that's overtaking their communities and has threatened their very existence and resulted in a loss of life. Returning from this trip, the youth were invigorated to engage in the movement for water justice. They joined the ranks of Sister Monica and We the People of Detroit, fighting against water shutoffs and advancing sovereignty. For the Love of Water upholds models of municipally owned water in the Great Lakes. The Black Mesa Water Coalition out west is resisting pipelines and other threats to water. The Indigenous Environmental Network and the Waterkeepers Alliance push for water protection and conservation. The Anthropocene Alliance is leading people in championing for policies to mitigate flooding. The U.S. Human Rights Network leads on the charge to demand water as a human right, as you said, Dr. Mena. The Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy collaborates with PolicyLink to co-lead the Water Equity and Climate Resilience Caucus, which engages in a peer model to share best practices and advance collective action on reforming existing policy and pushing for progressive policies such as the Water Justice Act. So in wrapping up, with the particular needs of this moment, the added legal threat of COVID-19 means that not being able to access water for hand washing can literally be a death sentence, and probably has been for too many. As we see, the demographic pattern of impact illuminates the communities that are most water insecure. A temporary moratorium on water shutoffs is necessary but far from sufficient. We must have a permanent system that guarantees access to water and all of the commons that are essential to life. As we stated in our report, Lights Out in the Cold, Reforming Utility Shutoff Policies as if Human Rights Matter, we lifted up the work again of Sister Monica towards the very same end. So in closing, really, whether it's advancing food security, zero waste, energy democracy, land sovereignty, water justice, or beyond, frontline communities are sparking 1,000 points of light that illuminate the path of transformation that we should all be on. A path to cease the advancement of catastrophic climate change and corporatocracy while uplifting human rights in harmony with Earth's bounty of natural, divinely designed systems and the life therein. The essentiality of water is central to our ecosystem, and access and sovereignty are critical to a just transition. So thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. I have to say that the fact that you use this moment to share with everybody all of the organizations doing this work is so important. To say the names, the titles. We want to get that list and make that available, because, you know, as we've had these discussions, oftentimes when we talk about racial injustice, we don't talk or focus on those that are actually doing this work. That's all of you. You know, where do you start? People say, where do you go? You just listed the work that is being done. So thank you for that. Much appreciated. And we want to get that list and share it with everybody who wants to be part of this movement. And now, last but certainly not least, you and I and others know her as the water warrior, Monica Lewis Patrick, President and CEO of We the People of Detroit. She's an educator, entrepreneur, human rights activist, and advocate. She's an active member of the Michigan Water Unity Table, U.S. Human Rights Network, Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, and DREM.org. And in 2019, she was appointed to the International Joint Commission's Great Lakes Water Advisory Board. So I want to turn it over to her before we kick it off for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mesa. And to the CBCF, I can't tell you what a privilege and an honor it is to be with you and all the esteemed guests on the panel. I would say that I consider myself an organizer and a mad as hell Black mama. But what you have before you is some of the greatest brain trust as it relates to environmental justice issues for Black folks and people around the planet are on this panel. So that is what you have before you, and I want to make sure that that's clear. But what I'm excited about is this opportunity to uplift not only the work that's happened in the great city of Detroit, but it's work that actually has set a template for the nation as it relates to water affordability. We sit in a city that since 2012 has shut off over 171,000 families, with anywhere from 2 to 4 children residing in those households. You have a city that 39% of the city lives in abject poverty. And then you also have that 60% of the heads of households are Black women, as I stated, with anywhere from 2 to 4 children. So when you have those demographics, and then you have a city that is actually subsidizing an entire region. The city of Detroit built a water infrastructure system that is providing water to about 40% of the state of Michigan. 3.8 million Michiganders get their water from a well that the residents of Detroit built. That system was built on a tax base that should be somewhere in the realm of about 2 million people. We now have somewhere in the ballpark of about 725,000 residents, and about 778,000 of them are children under the age of 17. So when you look at that tax base and you know that 70% of the people that work in the city of Detroit don't live in the city of Detroit, and that what you have had since World War II is that you've had a major exodus of white flight out of the city. You also had major industries, the big three in Detroit, left the city also and moved their plants outside the city. So your major tax base of the city of Detroit left the city of Detroit, while at the same time we were legislated in 1955 to build out this water infrastructure to the suburbs. So where you have 2.8 million Michiganders drinking from a well that the residents of Detroit built, you also have a political and racial divide that says, I don't believe that the residents of Detroit deserve the same access to that very same system. The other thing that we always have to make note of is there also has been 50 years of a racist narrative that justified not having equity and justice as it relates to water affordability in the city of Detroit and in the state of Michigan. So for those residents that don't live in Detroit, we are forced by the legislative body of the state of Michigan to sell water to our suburban customers wholesale. Now, mind you, the residents of Detroit are the owners, and we are forced to sell it to our own residents retail. So all of those suburban customers are marking their water up anywhere from 100 to 1,000%. And because they've been convinced that somehow they are subsidizing failed Black leadership in Detroit, they are also participating in the perpetuation of not humanizing the residents of Detroit enough to have access to their very own system. So this is how it lands at a very local level when we don't connect the dots in terms of how all of these things in terms of systemic racism are landing on the backs of communities. When you don't connect the dots that our pensioners in 2013 going into 14, when you had the contrived bankruptcy of the city of Detroit, one of the biggest assets that they were able to commandeer and move from public into a regional system, and eventually they have a desire to make it a private system, was the Detroit Water and Sewage Department. Well, that department not only was deeply connected to the pensions of the city of Detroit, it was deeply connected to the landowners and the residents of the city of Detroit. So you compile that and you connect that with systemic racism of over 100,000 residents in the city of Detroit have been illegally and unconstitutionally foreclosed on to the tune of about $600 million. Then you put on top of that our water rates have gone up over 400% in the last 20 years. And within the last 12 years, water rates have gone up over 120%. And when you compile that with the fact that wages have not kept pace with the increase of water costs, and then you put that in context to the federal scheme of things, where we know that the federal government has actually divested from water systems, that what we've seen since 1977 is that we've gone from the federal government investing about 69% of the dollars into our water infrastructure to now it's somewhere in the ballpark between 7 and 9%. And we know that we need about $6 trillion in order to really upgrade and invest in our water infrastructure. And when you've already decided in communities like Detroit and Flint, and in Chicago, where water rates have tripled in the last 8 years, and in Toledo, where water rates have doubled in the last 3 months, and Flint was on pace prior to COVID being announced, they were on pace for their water rates to double within the next 30 days. So this is not just happening in Detroit. And when you look across the nation, according to research that's been done by Dr. Elizabeth Mack out of Michigan State University in 2017, we were already on pace to seeing 35.6% of the nation not able to afford their water. And so I have to look at this, as Dr. Afia and others have stated, I look at this as a Black mama, understanding that we are the mothers of all civilization. And so understanding that, I am deeply connected to the concern, making sure that all mankind has a pathway to clean, safe, and affordable water. There have been women in the city of Detroit that already have been the architects of a water affordability policy that would actually move the nation closer to the human right to water and actually increase the revenue streams for those utilities. So the question must be to us, why is there such a specific intent to make sure in communities of color that we do not have the same access to clean, safe, and affordable water and the same revenue streams to be able to sustain clean access to clean, safe, and affordable water? So I'll stop there and take any questions that you may have, but our commitment is that this is a fight that we will not back away from, and we'll leave it with the words of the Honorable Coleman Alexander Young, who said, if you find a good fight, get in it. Well, we're in the fight for clean, safe, and affordable water, and we're gonna get it.
Amen. President Lewis Patrick, thank you for breaking that down and really what you just did there was unpack what systemic racism looks like at all levels, right? So as we talk about these water, increasing water costs and affordability, and I'm opening this up for the panel as we start to take questions, what is it that we do in terms of, you mentioned, for instance, the women in Detroit that are pushing the policy piece. Say more about that to us in terms of how to not only unpack this, but how to combat it at different levels. So we have, on the one hand, we're in a global pandemic, but these issues have started, decades before. And so can you talk to us about sort of how do you, what is, we the people of Detroit doing right now, and what are some examples of how to push against these structural barriers?
Well, what we the people of Detroit is committed to right now is not only supporting the human right to water and a water affordability plan for the city of Detroit, but we're deeply connected to ushering in a water affordability plan for the state of Michigan. There is work that has come out of the Michigan Water Unity Table that is rooted in grassroots ideologies and philosophies. It's deeply connected to indigenous folks and undocumented folks. Those were the people we started with when we had this conversation, because as we know, those things are deeply connected to social justice issues. Because We the People of Detroit is an organization founded by 5 Black women, and our work is rooted in social justice and environmental justice, as we've learned from Mama Rhonda Anderson at Sierra Club, is social justice work. And so through that lens, what we began to do is sort of think of what could we do to make sure, one, that we were educating ourselves as it related to our infrastructure, making sure that we were connecting the dots in terms of who held policy power and who did not. What was a waste of our time going to these sort of manufactured meetings where it looked like community was weighing in when it really wasn't on the record. And so we were able to sort of deconstruct some of those things. We also had to look at the fact that, as Dr. Afia alluded to, it's not easy to get shut off data. Well, in the city of Detroit, you used to get that information mailed to your home. So we begin to question, why are we no longer getting these reports from our water department that we're paying way more money than we used to? We're getting less and less information. And so we had to FOIA our government through one of our colleagues, Professor Kate Levy, who's a journalist and a photographer. She actually led with the ACLU the FOIAing of the city of Detroit's water department 8 times. And we were successful and won 8 pieces of litigation to get FOIA information. And we still, to this day, almost 7 years later, have still not gotten a complete data set of water shutoffs. So when you cannot really evidence the harm, then it makes it very easy for activists to be discredited as not knowing what they're talking about. Mm-hmm. But when you have leadership from people like the Honorable Joanne Watson, who was one of the champions, legislative champions of water affordability in Detroit, she, along with groups like Michigan Welfare Rights and the People's Water Board, they were able to bring community together. And then with people like, you have persons like Roger Colton, who's an economist and an expert on water systems and water rates, he was able to sort of bring to bear that if we were willing to put in place an income-based, tiered-based system that would allow those persons that fit within 200% to 150% of the federal guidelines of poverty, that those persons should not pay more than 2.5% to 3.5% of their income for water. In Detroit, you have anywhere from 10%, the majority of residents paying 10% and upwards of their income for water. In Flint, you have residents paying anywhere from $250 a month and upward for water that they cannot consume. But Dr. Mesa, the big thing that really concerned us the most is that in the state of Michigan, if you don't have running water for 72 hours, you can have your children taken from you. Well, we were seeing children taken in places like Detroit and Flint and Benton Harbor, but it wasn't happening in other communities. So when we began to ask what the difference was, it was only through creating our own research collective at We the People of Detroit, where we assembled academics and activists and most impacted community to begin to raise these questions, that we begin to get real answers. Because what we know is when they won't believe the activists, they may believe the academics. So thank God for people like Dr. Nadia Gaber, who was able to connect the dots around public health. We were able to evidence with Henry Ford Health Systems that there is correlation on a block level if water is shut off. Now, mind you, they were very afraid to evidence that information because they had $2 billion in contracts with the city of Detroit on the table. And so it became a game of, is the lives of Black folks, because they saying right now Black folks matter. But do we matter when you're putting up $2 billion in contracts and you know that, what, 1/5 of the city is getting sick? So these are the things that we're pushing back on. And so it was so brilliant for Dr. Gloria House and the Honorable Councilwoman Joanne Watson to come to us and say, all of you have been to the academy. Let's not relegate our power to somebody else. Let's convene our own table, use our own scientific ability, and then we'll deputize ourselves and put the information on the table. And so that's what we've done at We the People of Detroit. We haven't waited on anyone to come rescue us. We're saving ourselves, and we're connecting with other powerful people across the country and around the world to save ourselves.
Thank you. To our other panelists, building off of what Monica just shared, how do we imagine a new set of possibilities in this time of COVID-19, where everything that was just described is exacerbated tenfold? I mean, what are the practical approaches to that? And, Jackie, too, I mean, you just listed several, organizations that you work with that are invested in this fight. What are the common trends of those organizations? What are they getting that other people are not? And how do we close this information gap? If anyone wants to.
Thank you. So just a couple of things that I found in looking across the country. One is the more that the community was in control and making decisions, as we saw. I mean, that was really the victory of We the People of Detroit, was really pushing for decision-making power for communities. And that's the model that we found most effective, whether communities were influencing the externally held utility, or whether it was greater municipalization, so that that local localities were owning their own water systems, and therefore people were operating as almost as a water cooperative and having equal voice in how the decision making was made. Also, the resisting of privatization, which of course, when you have a system that's built literally off of profits as opposed to providing a critical resource, those have been critical models that needed to be pushed back on. And then also shifting funding, as we talked about before, this critical need for funding for infrastructure, looking at where the glut of funding is going. And there's some conversations now. There's a report that recently came out from Institute for Policy Studies about how we need to shift money from all the trillions of dollars we're spending in militarization and move them towards some of these critical resources. And I'll pause there. But those are some of the through lines that I found.
Okay.
Yeah, and if I could just chime in real quickly. I mean, President Louis Patrick, along with Jackie, gave us the format. The question is, are we willing to actually move forward? So when President Louis Patrick shared with us that it takes $6 trillion to deal with our crumbling water infrastructure that we have in our country, then right there tells us what we need to focus on. And inside of focusing, we can start that process right now in this COVID-19 moment. We can make sure that we are starting to actually train people for a number of different positions that would go into this economy to be able to address this. And then when we have to do the hands-on aspect of that training, then we make sure that we fill in that when people can get closer as we begin to have more protective ways around COVID-19. We can make sure that our HBCUs, we can make sure that our community colleges are playing a role so that we're helping to strengthen that infrastructure by bringing folks from the communities into this rebuilding that needs to happen. Now, folks will say, well, the resources don't exist. And Jackie just shared with you how we began to move resources from the military side of the equation to the human health and the people side of the equation. But I would also say that, we spend a huge amount of money in the development of fossil fuel pipeline. We have 2.4 million miles of fossil fuel pipeline in our country. That's enough to go from here to the moon and back, to the moon again and back, and then on your way back to the moon again. So instead of focusing the resources in that space, and to also make sure that, as Jackie mentioned before, there's a just transition. So those folks who have been working, in that space can move over because they have the skills. And we also bring this new set of workers in to actually be able to take advantage of this new cleaner economy, if you will. We often talk about energy democracy, and I have water as a part of that energy democracy paradigm, where we're giving people the power again to make decisions about what's happening on the local level. And when we don't do that, we see the privatization that folks have referenced. We see this inequality that makes people feel like they are less valued and dehumanized in the process. So let's also, in this new economy, and since we're talking about the water aspect of this, let's also make sure that the contracting and subcontracting opportunities, as President Patrick alluded to, are also going to our communities. But let's also make sure that this huge amount of new jobs that will be created are owned by people who look like us, who are creating the businesses in this space. And we often overlook that fact. We'll help people sometimes to get the training they need to work in a space, but we don't often give them the resources and capacity to own the businesses, because we know then those dollars will reverberate and recycle in our communities time and time and time again, which helps us to build the wealth that's necessary for us to then leverage our power into making sure that politicians are doing the right thing.
Mm-hmm. And on that point, I want to turn it over to Dr. Afia. A lot of your work is looking at water governance issues. So at the end of the day, we have people in power who are making these decisions consciously, right? And participating and arguably perpetuating, right, these massive gaps that are essentially costing lives, ripping families apart, right? So from a governance perspective, whether we're looking at the water utilities or the mayor of the city, what's the role they play in stepping up and pushing back against some of the very own policies that have created this mess in the first place?
Yes, well, as a political scientist and someone who is very much a student of power, we know that a lot of the issues that we're dealing with, including the utilities and issues around water affordability, even the opportunities for jobs, are linked to how the governance of these water utilities are carried out. The democratization of the utilities is important. We need our people to be a part of water boards. Everybody needs to know where's the decision making and the power and control about who is getting water, when, where, how, and at what price. Again, it's important that everybody knows that and participate. Some of the people who are on these boards are elected, some are appointed. But again, when we're talking about this year of elections and looking at all different levels of governance that we need to be involved in and have representation. It's also in the water space that we also need to be to look at, these positions of power and decision making that are controlling water access, quality, and other issues, especially pricing, in our communities. One of the things that I do when you talk about the training issues, I also have been looking at the water workforce and the opportunities that are there for people in our communities, where of course the jobs are paid relatively well. You don't need a college degree, but the availability of those jobs before the crisis, there was discussion about the aging water workforce and this great opportunity and wanting to have more, people of color as a part of the water workforce. But now we are going to have to look and see how the utilities, how this opportunity plays out based on the current, COVID-19 and the rearrangement of priorities that utilities are having. So whether or not that workforce opportunity is going to still be there, we have to really, continue to monitor that. But on the other side, as Dr. Ali said, my focus has also been on looking at opportunities for business. The funding that's needed to repair the aged infrastructure across the nation. EPA itself had, 230 something billion, dollars that's needed to repair the aging infrastructure across the country. So what does equity look like in terms of opportunities for Black folk and other people of color in terms of the contracts and awards that are going to be given for that? And the reason that this is important is for the very reason that we have issues and challenges with low income people facing issues with water cutoff and shutoff is that they can't afford to pay it. So if we can work around the social justice issues where economic justice and equity is addressed, as well as, you know, the power and decision-making issue. I think it was Jackie who mentioned, again, the issue around privatization of these of water services and utilities. I think we need to continue to push back against that from a human rights perspective. And that's where, you know, we really have to examine why the US has pulled out of the UN, even at the table when George Floyd's brother was, you know, making his appeal. They were not even there listening because they don't care about human rights and social justice issues, especially as it affects Black people. So there are a lot of areas and arenas from the global national arena where we take our case to the UN, but beyond that, what we do at the local level, pushing for infrastructure funds to come. We've been promised infrastructure money that was gonna come from the current administration. You know, have we seen it? So there's a lot of things that, you know, promises that have been made that just haven't been delivered.
Yeah, let me share. We're getting a lot of questions here on the piece around business. You mentioned Dr. Michael Huff is asking, are there grants available for Black entrepreneurs with innovative and natural water decontamination methods? We have a lot of individual, you know, questions like from Lisa Williams, who knows that there's an unfair utility fee from a minority community in Arkansas. You know, what's the first step? We have a lot of questions looking at like Jerome Ringo from National Wildlife Federation saying, you know, what domestic policies can be developed to act as a catalyst to resolving global water issues at the peak of our climate challenges. And there are questions here also about what can we learn from the work that's been done in an international sense to kind of better focus on some of those very same human rights issues around water justice in a domestic context. Anybody want to respond to some of those comments? I mean, at least for those of you who've done, go ahead, Dr. Ali, or, you know, your familiarity, right? We tend to have a focus, right, on models that that put a premium on, you know, water access, clean water, you know, in context. And so some questions here are saying, you know, what can we do, especially, for instance, there's a question here, in your opinion, what would be the first step for an organization like ours, who has up to now dedicated our time and resources to getting water to remote communities in sub-Saharan Africa? How do we start to swivel our focus into assisting with more local issues in the water sector across the USA? So any comments back to these questions? Too many to keep a hold of, but we're trying to get them in.
Well, let me talk to one of the things that could have been utilized if this administration had tried to do it. So in most administrations, you'll have a domestic policy council, you'll have an office in the White House for innovation and technology, you have the Environmental Protection Agency, you have the Department of Commerce and the Department of Labor. If an administration was amenable to it, it could focus those respective agencies together to actually address some of the issues that we've been talking about today. And when you unfortunately don't fill those positions, one, when you don't prioritize these disproportionate impacts that are happening in communities of color and lower wealth communities and indigenous folks, then you leave this huge gap. So to go to Brother Jerome Ringo's question and a couple of the others, our vote is so incredibly important to be able to actually have folks who understand that these entities and others have to be focused in an interagency way, so that one, we can leverage the resources that are necessary, and two, help to build the capacity for whether it is folks on the entrepreneurial side or our responsibilities in helping to either rebuild or create the new structures that are going to be necessary because of the current impacts we have and the impacts that we know that climate change is going to put on our systems, especially our drinking water systems.
Other comments?
just to build off of what Dr. Ali just expressed, some of what we approached it from is how could we bring in more revenue into our local and regional government to be able to sort of shore it up to advance water affordability. So we started meeting with groups out of Boston, Dr. Bob Zimmerman from the Charles River Watershed, because what they had done is done a process of looking at a CORC, a Community Water and Energy Resource Center, that would allow sort of the remediation of flooding. It would also remediate wastewater into gray water for commercial use. It also had some components to be able to generate thermal energy and electrical energy. So looking at that process, it became sort of looking at the copulation of best practices from different parts of the water sector, and then how to bring those together. And then part of the agreement with us was that if we move forward with that kind of project, it also had to be under the auspices of a community governance structure. So it was a way to deconstruct these large waste systems. It was a way to remediate some of our flooding. And then it was a way to also generate revenue. And so we've been really working on bringing this to fruition with some of our partners in Flint, with the Flint Development Center, which is also another amazing group of young people that will have the first youth-led water testing lab in the nation. And so we're excited about the opportunity to bring this along, because what we're also very concerned about, as Dr. Ife talked about, in the southern part of the nation, a lot of the land where utilities sit is Black-owned land. So we believe that also, if we're not very cautious in this moment about protecting our space and place, that we actually could get gentrified and moved off of our land by being priced out of our water and our infrastructure. So these two have been a big part of the information that has been funneled into this idea that this is the right time to move forward with a water affordability plan for the nation. And there are several places where we can get there with several pieces of legislation.
I just chime in and say that there's a link between the work that I've done at the global level in Africa and what I see here on the ground. And that is always that decentralized governance is important. One of the things that we did in Ghana in terms of trying to get people access to water, sanitation, and hygiene services was to launch a program, a strategy of local governance and decentralizing, decisions around water, and focusing on trying to get the local governing unit of an area to be responsible for, raising the money and identifying where the access, needs were, and then trying to work on getting the resources and the budget in the local government budget to address the water and sanitation issues that they have. Because depending on the ministry, the national government, where the budgets were scarce in terms of focusing on water, sanitation, and hygiene, was not proving very fruitful. But you have the same issue here as Mama Monica, President Lewis is saying, is that it's a local issue, because it's at the local level that the struggle for the financing for water services for communities is going to happen, because the government's contribution to infrastructure and running utilities has fallen off since the 1970s to maybe 6 or 7% of the revenue that a state gets. So really the initiative and the planning and the strategizing has to happen at the local level, at the community level. So I would say that that's something that needs to happen across the board, wherever you are.
Thank you. I want to take a moment to thank a lot of you have tons of questions. Thank you for your engagement. We appreciate it. Or of course, sorry, we can't get to all of them, but all of your comments to our panelists are generating a lot of discussions around urban renewal and revitalization. We have Christine Atieno talking about water governance and regulation needs to be looked at in terms of the extraction of water needs for the private sector. You know, we haven't even touched on opportunity zones and, you know, what that means for the communities that live there. So as we try to have this intersectional discussion, a lot of it is around comprehensive reform. You can't really talk about water rights in isolation because it has to do with your ability to afford your home. You know, being able to afford your water means you can also pay the rent at your home, that you can, right, that you live in a place that's not near a toxic waste dump, that you have a water utility that can, you know, elevate the concerns of its residents, right? And so that's not getting gentrified to the point where communities can no longer live there. And President Lewis Patrick, you alluded to that, just talking about sort of the, you know, Detroit flight, you know, with the big three out of the city. You know, if you're not really engaging and, you know, with the residents there, it's hard to really have an understanding of those issues. So I want to ask if, and I want to lift up Jackie Patterson's efforts here. She pointed out there's a People of Color and Environmental and Climate Justice website, and we'll make this information available to all of you who want to be involved in this work. Linda Fletcher has raised the issue of reparations in regards to urban renewal. She talks about her dream 100 years ago was to build sustainable communities in places like Bronzeville in Chicago, when skills banks and, you know, happened to be in the community. Same with Columbus, Ohio, also had a Bronzeville-like place that was destroyed by urban renewal. Due to this systemic, you know, racial system. So how do we do a better job of understanding the plethora of, you know, policy areas that need focus when we talk about water justice? What are some of those other areas that we should be thinking about when we talk about water affordability, sanitation services, water governance? What are some of those other critical factors interrelated that maybe we're not paying enough focus on that we ought to? Anyone?
So I have a basic for everybody. So, and it's real simple, and we've been trying to get people to do this for a long time. Have a full environmental justice analysis on both the state and the federal level before you move forward on policy and before you move resources and dollars to make sure that they are actually being focused on the communities that need them the most. I can't tell you I'm afraid to say it now, the quarter century of working, you know, in both on Capitol Hill and in federal agencies, and how that never seemed to be a priority for anyone in the process. And then folks want to come back after the fact and say, well, how did we miss these folks? Well, you missed them because they weren't prioritized at the beginning of the process. Of course, we know if your voices were there in the framing out, then it would not happen. It would not also happen if we made sure there was that environmental justice analysis. So for me, that is a critical element that moving forward, we can never allow major pieces of legislation to move forward without that being a significant component of it.
Thank you. President Lewis Patrick.
I would just agree with that. What we have learned from all of the esteemed panelists is to be very intentional about intersecting all of it. So we never talk about water affordability and water quality and water access without intersecting that there is a great need to be very intentional about job creating and contracts and training. We also are very intentional about intersecting that with a greater increase of power to those in the communities that are most impacted. And so we really try to speak from that framework, that it's not a one thing, but it's everything. And that we believe that we can think in these complex terms of how to integrate these things together. And so I'm just so appreciative of everyone that has been a part of sewing into our work to bring us along, because as we often say it, we the people of Detroit, we didn't find water, the water struggle found us, and we're grateful to be a part of it.
Thank you. Dr. Afia, sorry, I think you were gonna share some comments.
I lost my train of thought, actually. But I will say that definitely the Congressional Black Caucus has its 21st century principles of infrastructure. So there are some frameworks that are out there that are seeking to address if and when funding for water infrastructure comes, that the funding is targeted to our communities, intentionally targeted to our communities to redress some of the, social and other issues, barriers to opportunities that have existed. So we need to stay focused on that and see and watch when the legislation is going to come to address infrastructure across the nation and ensure that our people are getting funds from those resources for training, as we mentioned, training and job opportunities, but also business contracts and other areas.
Great. I want to, as we close and ask all of you to, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say that just a couple of things. That one is just agreeing in terms of being watchful for legislation as it comes. And also we as the NAACP are working on actually developing model legislation that we are starting to proactively advance so that we're kind of designing what we want and putting it in the hands of legislators. And also the other thing that last year in January, I went to a meeting on climate finance. And as I sat there listening, I thought, wow, I have no idea what's being discussed here. Like, they were talking about bonds and all these things, and I just had no idea what was going on. So then afterwards we launched this transformational climate finance initiative, and now we're about to publish this document, Resourcing Revolutionary Resistance and Resilience. And it looks at kind of this trajectory from kind of some of the traditional finance mechanisms that are out there, whether it's community development block grants, or as you said, opportunity zones, and kind of the pluses and minuses of it, and how we can actually be at the table, because we can't continue to not be involved in those conversations because they're a bit of a mystery in some ways. So we've developed both the toolkit and a training so that we can actually demystify that world, so that we actually do have small d democracy, and we're a part of those conversations. They're not something that just happens to our communities, as we talk about in terms of urban removal. And so whether it's that or it's the USDA loans that are available to rural electric co-ops or rural co-ops that do various utility work. And so we're really trying to demystify this whole finance space and make sure that we are players in finance, and we can move to this place where, as Brother Mustafa was saying, that we have a regenerative economy, that we're keeping money that's circulating in our communities, as opposed to, for example, the energy sector that sucks out $41 billion of our earnings every year, and we only get 1.1% of the energy jobs and less than 0.01% of the revenue from the energy sector. So similarly, whether it's the water space or others, we're really moving towards how to create more sovereignty, how to recognize what finance is available, and how to make sure that finance isn't extractive, that's actually regenerative and circular within our communities. So.
Thank you for that.
Can I just add one more thing, follow up on that very quickly? The reason that what Jackie said is important is because, one of the things that we can do right now is continue to push for the customer assistance programs that are being developed, for more of them to be developed that really meet the needs of low-income households. We know that one of the first programs that's considered a model program came out of Philadelphia, but the reason it's important is because different states have different laws in terms of, the ability of a utility to base its price on whether or not they can share the cost from of wealthier or higher income people with lower income people. So there are restrictions that exist. There's been some studies out of UNC and some other places that have been, looking at this issue of pricing, because the pricing is also going to be linked to the financing and the ability of the utility to govern and manage its full cost from, life cycle costing of all of the things that it takes to run and manage a water or wastewater utility. All of these things end up coming into the price of the water. So our understanding not only about financing that cities also engage in, in terms of, you know, bonds and interest loans and whatever that they get from banks and other things that end up, like from Baltimore, we know, end up coming back and, you know, falling on the necks of the people. So all of these kinds of issues being, yes, we have to be financially savvy and aware, right? We have to know about governance. We have to be a part of the boards and decision-making bodies that exist to determine who gets water, when, where, and how. And so all these factors, I think, are things that we have to look at and be ready to take up the mantle to address, to achieve water justice.
Yeah, thank you. So as we look to close this conversation, again, I want to thank all those joining us and all of this very rich conversation from our experts on this panel. I'd like to go around as we close and ask you all, you know, what top of the line suggestions, recommendations do you have for the policymaking world? And then the community that either benefits or is disadvantaged by policy decisions? What are your sort of takeaways for those two groups? Maybe we can start with Dr. Ali.
For the policy world, make sure there's a full environmental justice analysis of all the things that we're moving forward on. For those brothers and sisters on the local level, remember that you have power unless you give it away. So let's utilize our vote. Let's make sure that we're in those city and county meetings, helping to hold people accountable and helping to frame out the decisions that are going on. For those who are listening and watching, make sure that you are utilizing your resources to support the capacity that's needed by frontline organizations who are out there helping to protect your lives, and trying to also help to make sure that they're protecting our communities, and eventually, of course, all that lies into us protecting our planet.
Thank you, Dr. Ali. Ms. Patterson.
Thank you. That I think in the policy space that any of our policies must have a design that focuses on multi-solving. Like, we can't just have these myopic foci, but we have to recognize intersectionality in how we do policy, just as we do in how the problems evolve. So the policies that have been more successful have included everything from job creation to, you know, to community economic development, to whatever the resources, in this case water, that we're trying to advance, and that human rights have to be at the center of any policy making that we have. And then two, that in terms of at the local level, I would say that we should all be pushing for participatory budgeting and transparency, and again, community decision making, because yeah, we have to have eyes on how money's being spent, and how money's being spent follows what the priorities are. So we have to be at the priority setting table and the allocation setting table. And I think to all listening, getting money out of politics, because that is the root of all evil, I would say. So thank you.
Thank you. President Lewis Patrick.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much for having me. I would echo what my colleagues have said. I would also stress that we shouldn't be asking permission to be able to move policies forward that we know are best for our community. And so I would just encourage people to be bold, to not allow being stuck in trauma to paralyze us, that this is a moment of transformation. And we should be speaking into this moment that water affordability will come into fruition within our lifetime. And so we're not going to wait on that. We're going to deputize ourselves and move that forward. And so we're hoping that people will join us in some part of either advocating for legislation that we know is necessary, and some of that will be coming up over the next couple of weeks, everything from things embedded within the HEROES Act to things that we have seen the Senator Harris lead on as it relates to water infrastructure commitments. We're also encouraging folks to be a part of building plans of sustainability, because as we're seeing our young people step into their own power and their own leadership, part of being able to make demands that are addressing structural violence have to be connected to affordable rate structures and access to the human right to water. And so we'll leave it there, but I'm excited to be a part of this struggle and looking forward to the other side of victory.
Awesome. Thank you. Final thoughts, Dr. Afia?
Yeah, I guess I would just say that, as Jackie mentioned, the multi-lens is needed. Water, justice and equity issues are policies that are developed to address these issues have to look at economic justice, social justice, cultural justice and rights that people have. So really, you know, health equity issues, especially in this time of the COVID-19 pandemic, all of these things are important. And so any legislation that comes out we have to be able to tick the box off of the multifaceted nature of our struggle for water sovereignty and justice for African people around, not only here in the US, but around the world.
Thank you. With that, I'd like to ask to our attendees, we have a survey coming up here quickly to make sure we can continue to bring these critical conversations and policy recommendations, not only to the community, but to Congress. Again, on behalf of the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation, I want to thank our amazing, extraordinary panelists, experts that have been doing the very important work day in and day out. There is a blueprint for change. We have organizations on the ground right now that are doing this work. So again, you know, thank you to Jackie Patterson, Director of the NAACP Environmental and Climate Justice Program. Thank you to Dr. Mustafa Santiago Ali, Vice President for Environmental Justice with the National Wildlife Federation. Thank you to Monica Lewis-Patrick, President and CEO and co-founder of We the People of Detroit. Of course, thank you to our very own Dr. Afia Zakiya, putting CBCF on the map with water justice issues. And of course, thank you to Senator Kamala Harris for all the work that she has been doing in advancing water justice, equity, and opportunity. Thank you to all those who've tuned in. On behalf of the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation, we thank you. Thank you for joining us. Come back to us, use our hashtag CBCFINC, come to our website, learn about our annual legislative conference. We will continue the conversation on these and several other issues. Stay safe. We know the Black Lives Matter movement started long before it hit the news. We've been in this space and we want to put a racial equity and human rights lens on these issues. Tune in if you need any more resources. Stay safe and healthy. And with that, we bid you farewell. Thank you so much.